Hi everyone, welcome back to the Towards Data Science Podcast. Now, trustworthy AI is one of today's most popular buzzwords. Everyone seems to agree that we want AI to be trustworthy, but definitions of trustworthiness are often fuzzy or inadequate. And maybe that's not surprising. It's hard to come up with a single set of standards that add up to trustworthiness and apply just as well to a Netflix movie recommendation as a self-driving car. So maybe trustworthy AI needs to be thought of in a more nuanced way that reflects the intricacies of every potential AI application. But if that's the case, then new questions come up. Who gets to define trustworthiness in a particular context, and who bears responsibility when a lack of trustworthiness leads to harms like AI accidents, undesired biases, or other AI pathologies? Through that lens, we can quickly see how trustworthiness is a problem not just for algorithms, but for organizations. And that's exactly the case that Beena Ammanath makes in her upcoming book, Trustworthy AI, where she explores AI trustworthiness from a practical perspective, looking at what concrete steps companies can take to make their in-house AI work safer, better, and more reliable. Beena joined me to talk about defining trustworthiness, explainability, robustness in AI, as well as the future of AI regulation and self-regulation on this episode of the Towards Data Science Podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think you have a really great sort of 10,000 foot view on this very complex space of trustworthy AI and AI trustworthiness, which I think definitions get very fuzzy very fast in this space especially, so it'll be good to kind of parse things out a little bit. But I'd love to get a sense before we dive in for what brought you to this space in the first place. Like, what drew you to this area of trustworthy AI, and yeah, what's the backstory there?
Yeah. And before we go into my backstory, I'll tell you the 10,000 foot view comes from the fact that I've been in the weeds. So it started from the weeds to come up to this level. My background is as a technologist. I have, I'm a trained computer scientist, and I've always been in the data space for, throughout my career. It's just that, that space has changed and evolved so much in the 2.5 decades that I've been in this space. Right. When I started, it was a SQL developer, SQL server.
Right.
And that was pretty much the leading database along with Oracle. That's all we had for databases, right? And then I've seen the evolution from, to data warehousing and BI, and then came Hadoop, and that opened, a whole new avenue to how to use data. So my training as a technologist keeps me very anchored on technology. But as AI started becoming real, I realized there's a lot of cool things you can do with AI, but there were, negative consequences that could happen with the AI, right? And what we've seen in the past few years is a lot of headlines and a lot of conversation around ethics and AI. And for me, Jeremy, I think of it as, we are in that technology phase with AI where the technology itself, the core AI technology is not itself fully mature, because we are seeing researchers still, developing the next wave of deep learning or reinforcement learning. And that technology is still maturing, right? I just read, from facial recognition, now we are able to go into, recognizing humans just by their eye, right? So, the technology itself is maturing. So that's one stream. And then there's a parallel stream where we're using that technology in the real world, which has real human impacts and which is driving real business value for organizations. And so everybody is using a technology that is still not fully matured, and we don't really understand all the consequences of that technology. And then the third stream is what I call under the trustworthy AI bucket, is really around the ethical implications, driving bias and transparency, but also about, being compliant and being, developing regulations and policies around it, best practices. None of that exists. Now, each of these three streams that I just painted out is all accelerating at its own pace.
Right.
And I think it's very important. Just as we think about the value creation of AI, it's very important to think about how do you actually make sure that value is positive. It's not driving negative value. It's not leaving humans behind. It's not driving inequity. It is driving more equality. It is truly making human lives better. I'm a technology optimist, right? Because as a trained technologist, I know that AI can do amazing things for humanity, for the world, but it can also do negative things if we don't help it focus on the amazing things that it can do. So that's my background, and that's what keeps me very focused on that third stream, because I think that third stream is very much at around a few catchy headlines. It needs to get beyond that headlines to make it real in the real world, in real businesses, in organizations. And that was the impetus for me to write the book. My background also, Jeremy, has been working across different industries, right? I've been at GE and done worked on predicting jet engine failure, predicting failure of machines in a factory floor. I've been at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, looking really at the how do you think about ethics when you're selling hardware that's enabling some of these AI solutions? What does ethics mean in that context? I've been at British Telecom, where it was more about the uh, human connection. I've been at E-Trade, where it was more around personalized marketing and using data to provide personalized marketing. Now, each of these scenarios, that third stream that I mentioned, trustworthy AI, is going to look slightly different. For example, if you are not using human data in your algorithms, if it is not driving direct human impact, then it is not so much about bias as it is about reliability of the algorithms or the security of the algorithms. So trying to bring together all my diverse experience, my grounding in technology together in one place is really the book Trustworthy AI.
Yeah, and it strikes me as an important mission, not least because, as you mentioned, we have this phenomenon where all these AI capabilities are accelerating much faster than it seems we can keep up. There's been a lot of talk about whether regulation can keep up, whether the people who are used to doing AI ethics can be retrained in technology fast enough to keep up. And with so much, I mean, one of the things that I personally worry about quite a bit here is there's such a strong economic gradient pushing anyone who is technologically capable enough to contribute to capabilities to get them to work on capabilities rather to get them to work on trustworthiness, safety, things like that. So I mean, I imagine that's a real challenge here, and I think it's part of the reason why there's so much fluff in this space, right?
Yes, absolutely. No, you hit such an important point, right? I don't think regulations will ever be able to keep up. So it needs to be a balance between, regulations are coming. We're going to see regulations and policies coming around the space, but you're also there's going to be a balance between those regulations and self-regulating.
So when you talk about self-regulation, what for people who are less familiar with the incentives behind that, it can seem a little bit mysterious. Why would companies decide to self-regulate? Could you unpack some of the incentives around that? Like, what is it that makes companies decide to move in that direction?
Yes, absolutely. I think right now the impetus is all the headlines being called to, public hearings about what their organization is doing. And, it's a brand and reputational risk. It is financial risk. It is talent risk because, the more and more employees want to be aligned to a mission that resonates with them and that where, that AI is being used for not doing harm, right? Not necessarily for good. It can be for pure business value, but as long as it's not really doing harm. So I think there are a number of risks, whether from brand or reputational risk to financial and workforce risk. And that will be that trigger. That will be the reason that companies will start thinking about self-regulating.
And do you think it's enough? I mean, do you think that,
No.
especially given, yeah, no, okay.
No, I don't think it's enough. I think that motivation needs to be there. I think it's beginning to take shape, but honestly, Jeremy, it is still very early stages. I'm hopeful if we speak again next year, maybe we are in a better place where companies are proactively thinking about the ethical implications, the being responsible and, self-regulating to some extent. But in parallel, there are regulators who are working on defining what regulations look like. Again, I don't think it'll be regulation just for AI. I think for regulations to work, it will have to be very much around extending out external existing regulations to include the AI component, because AI is so context specific. It is very specific to given how the AI is used in a certain scenario. So
Mhm.
what that means is that regulation for that AI technology has to be relevant in that scenario. Take the case of facial recognition, right? One of the most controversial topics that we've heard about from an AI perspective is facial recognition, how it is terrible, and it has been banned in certain places. And here's the thing with facial recognition: you can use it in a, say, in a law enforcement scenario when you're trying to identify criminals. you know if that facial recognition technology is not fully robust, is not unbiased, is really truly works, it needs to be 100% accurate, right? Because the impact of that technology being not fully vetted out is terrible, right? You're going to have the wrong people being arrested for crimes they did not do, and you do not want that. But if you're using facial recognition for, say, identifying human trafficking victims at from a traffic light, right? And that technology is being used by startups right now for doing exactly that. um, that is a scenario where, yes, if you can rescue 50% more victims than you could just by using human intelligence, then absolutely, I think we should use it. But again, it's a decision of the organization. If you're using facial recognition to unlock your phone, for example, right, it's a convenience and it is something that consumers can choose to. But if you're using facial recognition, say in the scenario of a manufacturing plant setting, to see if somebody is dozing off at a very critical work while working on a very critical machine, right? Very dangerous situation. I think the organization has to make the decision on it. Yes, by this technology is biased, but it is helping us save 85% more than we could without using this technology. It's a decision that the C suite, the board members, the stakeholders of that organizations have to make. It is never going to be a one size fits all.
Yeah, I really like the idea of looking at domains of application rather than the underlying technology as a way of getting around some of the thorny issues when it comes to defining. I mean, you see this all the time in the European context, falling over themselves trying to define AI in some kind of robust way when we don't have a definition of intelligence, let alone artificial intelligence, that anybody can agree on. And so you have this just attempt to do philosophy on a deadline that just doesn't work because the people involved tend to not be technically savvy enough to kind of come to those definitions, if even you could define these things in the first place, which is challenging enough. One thing I wonder about, though, is so this flip side of the story where in some cases, especially with foundation models, so we're now finding these models with very general purpose capabilities, systems like GPT-3 that can do not just text autocomplete, which is what they were trained to do, but now also translating between languages, writing code, doing web design, and so on. With these kinds of models, the potential malicious applications or the potential accident risks that come from their misuse and mishandling seem non-negligible, and I wonder if this affects your thinking about regulation at the level of application domain rather than regulating the process of developing models or the process of protecting them. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I'll challenge that a little bit about, regulations. I don't think it needs to be fully regulated. It can never be fully regulated.
Mm-hmm.
Here is what I would challenge: the creators, the developers, the technologists, the smart, brilliant brains who are building it. Can they spend 10% of the effort that they took into developing it into thinking of what are the ways this could go wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and proactively address it? I'm going to challenge the technologists, the engineers, to say, spend whatever percentage they can contribute to think proactively about what could go wrong and put in those guardrails, right? Because with great technology comes great power, and you cannot just create this powerful technology and unleash it out to the world and see how it goes, right? You really need to also have whatever project planning methodology you're using, whatever development methodology you're using, put in a step there to have a brainstorming, an ideation session on what are the ways this could go wrong, and address those things. And Jeremy, there is no way you're going to get 100% of all the ways it could go wrong, but
Hmm.
even if you get 50%, it's better than putting out this powerful technology with no thought on the ways it could go wrong and addressing it. So
Yeah.
I think technologists have to take some ownership on making sure that they're thinking about the negative consequences and addressing it proactively, even if it is just 10% of the things that they could address. Because we have brilliant minds, brilliant people who are working on this. So why can't we have those brilliant minds also focus on the ways it could go wrong? I know it's hard because as a technologist, I'm always enamored by all the cool things AI can do. Ooh, the shiny new thing that it can do. But I think it's time to step up and take responsibility.
Yeah, it certainly seems appropriate given it seems like one story you can tell about the last 20 years, let's say in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, is that gradually like the locus of power in startups and big organizations like software companies has started to consolidate around the engineers themselves and away from strategic management. And there are now decisions being made by engineers on a day-to-day basis, like, should we build this feature into the model? Should we build that feature? How should we debias? How should we scale, or whatever, that have deeply strategic implications with profound business impact that if the C-suite were aware, if the executives were aware that these decisions were being effectively outsourced to these development teams, they might go, whoa, 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 like we have to be involved in that process. Is there some kind of like gap bridging that needs to happen there? Like, is there some sort of
Yes.
infrastructure or way? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I do talk about it in the book as well, like changing fundamental processes, or how you do whether it's development. Like when we talk about AI, Jeremy, and to your point, I'll say we're talking mostly about the companies that are developing and building AI, but I think trustworthy AI is important also to the companies that are just buying AI or using AI. So in either scenario, right from the board member to the intern that's working in your company, everybody should have a basic fluency of AI, should have a basic fluency of what are the ethical principles that our organization believes in and that we should be following. And what that means, how does it translate to real life? Every organization, every company has an integrity training that you have to take when you join as a new employee. And I think extending it out to say that these are the ethical principles that we are aligning behind, and and here are the things you need to watch out for. So it's not just the engineer, it is that marketing intern in your organization who is looking, doing the first pass of vendors who provide personalized marketing tools, who can ask those questions. Has your algorithm been tested for fairness? What was the data set you used? So empowering every employee right from the board member to the C suite is the first step to get your organization on the path to building trust and ethics into your AI systems. And it only comes when you have that base level fluency. And if you want to go further, then you can go into role specific. Say you are a sourcer, then here are the questions that you should be thinking about. Here are the ethical implications that you should be thinking about. If you are a data scientist, here are the things you should be considering. Because it's not just a technologist problem to solve, it is a problem to solve across the organization, because the risk, if you don't solve for it, is across the organization.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean your job as an executive is really to propagate culture, like a certain kind of culture that you don't have the time to make every micro decision. That's the point of having employees, and so you try to give them this like very low bandwidth thing. I mean, culture is a low bandwidth product, and you hope that people will interpret it correctly. But yeah, it does seem like AI is one of those domains where translating that culture into, okay, like what does that mean for the loss function that I choose? What does that mean for the architecture that I choose? That gap definitely seems like something that needs to be bridged.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a lot of work, that's happening in startups and in academia in developing these kinds of trainings. And I think even providing it to when you are an MBA student or an engineering student, right? Taking it down to that level, making it part of your core curriculum, hopefully will fix for the next wave of, the next generation of the workforce. But here's the other thing that, I've seen working. There is an entire chapter on this, and it's accountability. Whenever you are building an AI solution, have it as part of your process or a step to define who is accountable for this if it goes wrong, because that just and if it's is it the data scientist who built the algorithm who is that's doing personalized marketing? Is it the VP who owns the whole IT mandate for AI? Is it the CIO? Is it the CEO? Having defined upfront, putting it on paper actually makes people more aware, because if you have the CIO's name as accountable for this AI solution, trust me that a CIO is going to be deeply vested in making sure that solution is works and is ethical, right? So I think part of it is introducing these nuances of making sure that people really step up. It's not just one person's job; it is everybody's job, as part of the organization.
And do you have any thoughts about where specifically that responsibility should lie? So I'm thinking here about, a self-driving car crashes. Let's say it's a Tesla because they seem furthest along here, or Cruise, and you go, okay, well, maybe somebody was killed or injured. As you say, do we blame the engineers who developed it? Do we blame the CPO who told the CEO that the product was ready to launch? Do you have any thoughts about the principles that people could use to reason, like what part of the chain does which level of responsibility lie for something like that?
I think there needs to be a sole, you know, uh, role or who is accountable, right? Who's going to face the Senate hearing if if another human dies? Like, who's going to go and face the court?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and raising awareness that this is what happens, and will not only get, everybody involved in the discussion, but also being able to think um proactively and deeply about the ways it could go wrong and address it. It's not a single person. It is meaning it's not in all scenarios it's a data scientist, or in all scenarios it's a CEO. I think it's going to depend on the organization's own maturity. Right now, what we're seeing is it's always the CEO who has to go and face if things go wrong, right? Because that accountability has not been defined. But you might find scenarios where the risk is much lower, right? If you show the wrong ad to the wrong person, you might put in a more junior level person as accountable for it. But if it is about a wrong diagnosis to a patient, you might want a more senior level person, right? And at the end of the day, that person has to sign off, yes, I take accountability for it, because that's what fundamentally needs to change within the company's culture and processes for for us to see more focus, to going back to your earlier point on self-regulating, right? So I think again, just like AI, it's not a one size fits all. It will depend on the use case, actually.
It does ring true because it's got to be so different case to case. I mean, every application is different. Whether you're building like internal tools for a company and the mistake only involves a loss of money or actually killing someone, I wonder if one other dimension to this might be the level of cognition that we're offloading to the AI. So when I think about where we're going with, again, foundation models and increasingly powerful systems, it seems like we're having them do more and more of our thinking for us. And it seems like that lives at one end of the continuum, where we're trusting AI systems with stuff like potentially managing, nuclear fusion reaction, which no human being can plausibly expect to oversee. And on the other side, you have like a simple decision tree, or even a statistical mean, if you think of that as a machine learning model. And then I feel quite comfortable blaming the data scientist who misinterpreted it, or the person who works with it. So is that a dimension that you see as important here?
Absolutely, absolutely. So take the example of natural language processing, of being able to generate text. Um, uh, I know we've seen enough examples where an AI can call and make an appointment for you, right? And
Mm.
which is cool because you can outsource, and the AI is going to make your next salon appointment, and you don't have to keep calling back or don't have to figure it out. But what if that AI is actually uh, speaking on your behalf, right? What if I outsource that AI, who is a digital
Right.
twin of me, to have this conversation with you? Is that ethical? Is that, what are the implications there if the AI says something, but it was trained on my digital twin data? So I think the complexity and that use case again comes into the play is it depends on where it's used and how it's used, that exact same technology is can be used differently.
Okay. Well, great. Now I'm going to barrel right into a very contentious question just to pivot things because I think this is one to focus down. Your book is about AI, trustworthy AI, and the term trustworthy AI is one I think that's fairly controversial in terms of what it actually means and just its definition. So I guess my first question is like I'd love to hear you define trustworthy AI, and specifically, I'd love to get your sense of whether you think trustworthiness is a property of a specific AI system or a property of an organization or team that manages or deploys AI systems, if that makes sense.
Interesting. That's a great question. So, trustworthy AI, to my earlier example, trustworthy AI is everything that falls under that third stream. So, trustworthy AI includes ethics, fairness, and bias, but also includes the robustness and reliability of the algorithm, includes, adhering to data privacy, adhering to safety and security. And it's all grounded on governance and compliance and existing regulations. So trustworthy AI is everything that falls in that fuzzy area beyond the value creation of AI. And where does it fall in terms of where you would place trustworthy AI? I think it's actually a scenario where if you start with as a technology, AI is mature comparatively in terms of its use case in the world, right? So if you're starting from ground zero, if you're a new organization, a new team that is looking at using AI within your organization, then thinking about trustworthy AI early on and putting the guardrails in so that your team can innovate faster, that's the ideal scenario. Defining what are the ethical principles, what are our trustworthy characteristics, and we define those guardrails so that the team can innovate faster. That's a great scenario, but most companies are already using AI in their teams today with for either for internal use or for external. They're using it, so it is more of doing an assessment of all the AI they currently have, and then being able to do almost a backfill to make it trustworthy, but also setting up for future uses of AI that can be trustworthy.
And so would it be fair to then say that trustworthy AI, by your definition, has to do with side effects? Like we're trying to minimize.
Yes.
Okay, so it's
Yes.
undesirable side effects that we're trying to minimize.
It is to reduce the number of unintended consequences, because so many times the questions so many times when the headline comes up, it's like, oh, we didn't think about it, right? It's an unintended consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And what trustworthy AI is reduce those unintended consequences. How can you proactively think about it, remove those unthought of side effects? Let's proactively think of those side effects.
Okay, great. So with that definition in mind, I think you have a number of different, I think 6 different elements, if I
Yes.
remember correctly, to your definition of trustworthiness. Or sorry, 6 different, I guess, subfields that play into it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was just going to say, to give context, it's just, at this point in time, even if you can go across, think through each one of those dimensions, I think, you would have at least put in enough time to think about the side effects. It's
Right.
by no means fully comprehensive.
Okay, no, great. And it's good to have that in mind because I think really no attempt to mitigate the side effects of deployed AI systems is going to be 100%, surefire. But so one of the dimensions, one of those 6 things that goes into defining AI, trustworthy AI, is transparency and explainability. And I'd love to hear kind of explain what you mean by that. And specifically, I'm curious about when you think a model is explainable enough, or how we should think through that threshold.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And, explainability is one of those cases where, everybody had, it's like, we all have this massive elephant and everybody's just looking at their own little part. And explainability has to be it's part of your design or planning process. You need to define, who does this model need to be explainable to? Is it just the data scientist and the data science team, the AI engineers? In that case, the language you use, how you would explain, would be different. It'll be referring to, here are the libraries that I used, here is the data I trained on. It will be more technical. But does it need to be explainable to the CEO or the board? Is it, again, to your point, it is about how risky is this, right? So if you're explaining it to the C-suite and the board members, then it's a level of explainability that needs to be more verbose and ties into the broader business context. If you need to make it explainable to the end user, who can be an external customer or an internal customer, it needs to be looked at from that lens. So explainability is true only when the person who you're explaining to understands it. It's not explainability to the developer who developed it. It is explainability to your target audience. And that's the nuance. And that's why it's complex. Like everything with AI, this is one of those areas that is complex. It's not a one size fits all. I feel like I'm repeating it, Jeremy, but it's not going to be a one size fits all. And that's why the thought needs to be put into it when you think about explainability. Who does this need to be explainable to? And here are some nuances around transparency. How much transparency do you want to have? Because we know that the more transparency, the more that system is going to be open to potential hacks or, malicious actors coming and training it with rogue data, right? How much of the transparency do we want to have, if it is going to expose core IP, right? So those are the decisions that you need to make as a team, as an organization, to then define the path forward. How much transparency that are you going to really provide? And the reason to do it is, it means that you've thought through it. It's not an afterthought. When you go through this process of thinking through transparency and explainability, yes, there is additional work in terms of, if you want to make it explainable to every customer that's going to look at it, and to the C-suite members, there is going to be multiple variations of it. But that also makes your AI more robust in a way that it's thought through, right? You've thought about the side effects and you've mitigated it to as much as you can. It's not going to be 100% covered, but you've at least thought through it.
Yeah, this is really where I'm a fan of processes like algorithmic impact assessments or model cards that, you don't necessarily, like you say, they're not necessarily going to solve your problem. It's more that it imposes this step of reflection and thoughtfulness in the development process where at least you're contemplating some risks, you're contemplating the side effects. Yeah.
I like to, think of it as being mindful
Mm-hmm.
about AI. I almost named this book "Mindful AI" actually, because it's really just being mindful. The things that you're building, the things that you're creating, or the things that you're buying today can have side effects. Just be mindful of it. Just be aware of it. That's the first step. We've been too caught up in the headlines, and we've been trying to solve it at this very high level. And what I'm trying to say is, you need to take more responsibility at the organizational level, at your team level, at an individual level within your organizational context, to say, yes, I have thought through it and I've done my best, and this is what we thought through. Because the next time a new team comes in, a new team member, they can see what has been thought through and say, oh, you didn't think about it. And you keep adding on to it, right? And isn't that part of the robustness part of it, right? Where you've actually made your AI solution or AI product truly robust.
Right. Actually, that brings us to robustness, which is something we've talked about on the podcast in the context of AI alignment and making sure that future AI systems don't exhibit, let's say, dangerous behaviors when they encounter scenarios that they haven't encountered before. Could you give some examples of robustness failures maybe that you've encountered in your professional life working on AI in production?
Yeah, absolutely. I also define robustness also in terms of being able to not go wrong easily, right? And I think the classic example is chatbots. Everybody who has been on the AI journey has experienced some version of the chatbot going rogue. We know all the famous ones, but that's something that I've seen in my own experience, right? Or being able to, when you are building a chatbot, thinking about accessibility, right? It's something that it doesn't come proactively. Another one that I can think of was this device, and this was more of a precursor to the floor, the automated vacuum cleaner, the floor one,
The Roomba, yeah.
right? Yeah, so it was trained on data, which didn't take into account some Asian cultures where people actually sleep on the floor, and they would it was trained to pick up pet hair,
Hmm.
right? But it and the hair that's engaged, that's not attached to anybody's head, but it actually went and sucked up a lady's hair who was actually sleeping on the floor, and that's very common in some of the cultures. So that's a scenario where it was not robust enough, because it's not thinking about the different cultural or different scenarios where it could go wrong. And the reason it's important to think in the context of that, the floor vacuum cleaner, because in that case you can define what does robustness mean for this AI product, right? Uh, and it removes that conversation of, oh, but in healthcare this would be what robustness is, or this in a factory this would be. You need to always define that box, or the what is your solution doing, and define robustness in the context of that box.
Yeah, that no, that makes perfect sense, and it sort of reflects the fact that often the solutions that AI systems come up with are dangerously creative and impossible for humans to anticipate. And so, trying to come up with a very broad rule that covers everything, like we're never going to be able to outthink a Roomba that's had who knows how many hours of training time to kind of dissect the optimal strategy to do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, and that brings me to the point of just it's crucial to have diversity on your team, right? To have not only from a gender or race perspective, but also from different cultural, geographic backgrounds, and again from the product that you're focusing on, right? It's you have to decide, what are the perspectives that we are missing at the table, and make sure that either you track for it, or try to get some voices from that to bring in those missing perspectives. I don't think we do enough of that.
As well, diversity of political thought. This is a dimension that I think is I think obviously very important, because people with different political worldviews have different world models in a very fundamental way, and yet it seems to be underemphasized. At least from my perspective, there's a lot of talk about sort of diversity of physical characteristics. But as you say, cultural diversity is an aspect of that. Political is almost a subset of cultural diversity, where you sample people from every different kind of geographical coordinate in the country. And when you look at representation in tech, it does tend to skew along every single one of those axes. And yet, I guess one of the challenges with that sort of thing is like, does this introduce problems from a recruitment standpoint, whether at the political or cultural levels? Like, how would you think about that sort of problem from a recruitment standpoint?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'll just say at a higher level, if your AI is not working with human data, you don't really need to, worry so much about uh, about the different nuances, right? It all depends on what is your AI doing. It is hard to get that cultural perspective, but being able to acknowledge and document in your process that here were the people at that table, at our table, when we
Hmm.
designed or developed or built this AI. And again, it comes to the same thing of you will never be 100% accurate. You may not even know what the gaps are,
Right.
right? So having a rubric of what is a list of diversity that you need, which factors are important for our product, and trying to get in that perspective, either through direct recruitment or through tapping into think tanks or research groups who are focused on those that specific cultural group, right? There are organizations focused specific cultural groups. So maybe you just need a representative from that group to come in and test your model or test your ideas, or test your hypothesis. Just like in the past, we used to have I'm blanking out on the term, but you would have testers coming in and testing a new taste for a new
Mhm.
juice, for example, right? You need to make sure
Like a
that
focus
when
group.
you yeah, you need a exactly, sorry, you need focus groups to make sure that your gaps are identified and that you're addressing it, because it's impossible to cover every aspect of diversity in every AI team. That is, I think that is impossible. And I think we should get creative about how we fill those gaps.
Yeah, and actually, this also makes me wonder about smaller companies because, of course, larger companies, more revenue, you can afford to go through this sort of process. Are there things along the continuum, let's say, to the full focus group approach that might work at the margins to help make things a little bit better?
Yeah, so here's my hope that, if we can get the large organizations to figure this out, and over time we will, what we don't have today is playbooks and best practices
Right.
on things that work, right? Like everything, there are best practice for right from ML ops to DevOps to, all of those technology components. There's no playbook around trustworthiness or ethics. And that's what, like if the large organizations in healthcare can do it, then I think the startups in healthcare can then learn from those best practices, from the playbooks, and then start and evolving. It is you're absolutely right. It is very hard if you're a startup to stretch out into focus groups and go beyond your product charter to really think about those side effects, right? So over time, my hope is we'll have playbooks, best practices. There's a lot of literature out there, but today what happens is most of the literature is more theory, and it's not necessarily tangible and practical application. But I think we're going to reach an era of where you're going to see more of that coming from the large organizations that can then help the startups and smaller companies to learn from them. Today my advice to smaller companies would be, include some time in your product planning design phase to think about the side effects and
Yeah,
address as much as you can.
yeah. I mean, it almost seems like that idea of deciding on a certain percentage of your development cycle, so you're going to devote to making sure that there aren't second order effects to what you're doing that are undesirable, is probably the best thing we can hope for at the moment. Do you actually expect that the best practices that we'll see are going to consolidate fast enough to be relevant given how quickly things are accelerating? So in this context, I'm wondering, like, in the, say, pre-2020 era, before foundation models like GPT-3 became a thing, we had this era of just pure narrow AI. And pure narrow AI, right, you can regulate it at the domain of application, and the application is equivalent to the model. But when we talk about foundation models, that mapping breaks, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of the thinking that we'd done about narrow AI becomes invalid. And I guess I wonder if, like, should we expect to ever be able to quite catch up with our best practices and our playbooks?
Yeah, no, I think it will be, uh, I don't, the technology is moving too fast to be able to catch up. There will always be new technology evolutions that come at us and that challenges us. Here's why it's happening, right? Because all of the investments go into the value creation from AI or technology, right? It's there is very less investment onto the side effects of that technology.
Mm-hmm.
Even going beyond AI to think about metaverse. AI is a big component of it, or NFTs, right? Where AI is not so much a big component of it, but there are all these technologies coming at us, and they're blending together and creating new scenarios.
Yeah.
So I think it's impossible to play catch up. It is just embedding that fluency that I come back to, right? Embedding it in your DNA to think about the ways it could go wrong. Metaverse, great, but what are the ways this could go wrong? Who is it going to leave behind? How do we make sure that we don't drive more inequity? Who is thinking about that? We don't see enough about it, right?
Yeah.
So it is really important to get into our DNA, and maybe it is by going down to the schools and colleges level and making sure our future workforce doesn't come just thinking about technology and value creation, but is also thinking about the negative side effects. And and is fully aware into it. For our current workforce, it is more of, we need to train them. We need to make sure that they're thinking about this, that metaverse developers should be thinking about how her work is going to have, probably drive more inequity. What if people don't have access to computers? What's going to happen to them? Are they going to be, how do we proactively think about it? And it's not something you and I can, decide for anybody, but it needs to be part of the DNA.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It also jives with, I think, a lot of what we're seeing nowadays in terms of companies being, to some degree, the capabilities, the raw capabilities, are starting to get so significant in AI, so powerful, that the thing that limits our ability to get value from our AI systems is less and less the capabilities of those systems and more their alignment with our values. So we look, for example, at GPT-3, which is objectively a super powerful next word predictor. It's like an incredible autocomplete system, right? And we have others like Gopher and Microsoft Turing and LG and so on. But you do get, toxic outputs sometimes that make users go, whoa, like that's not what I want. So I guess I would hope, and I wonder if you would agree with this, but I would hope that over time, as our ability to get value from these systems is limited by our ability to make them more robust and align them with our values, that we will get better and better at just that, that it will become an inextricably linked process with the capabilities building process. Do you think that's realistic? Or?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely agree with you. Couldn't have said it better.
Okay, well, let's hope.
Let's hope.
Let's
Let's
hope.
hope. That's my ardent hope, for my children, for the future generation. It is up to us to really get this right and, get more mindful and thoughtful about those side effects.
Awesome. Well, Beena, thanks so much for joining me for this really fun conversation. So many different topics that we covered, so I do appreciate it.
Jeremy, thank you so much for having me.